Blood dripped from Zoe's split lip as she stood defiant before the board of directors. "You thought I was just another black girl to be discarded," she said, clutching the envelope containing Harold Montgomery's final will. "But today, I become the majority shareholder of Montgomery Industries." Before we dive into this incredible story about kindness, prejudice, and unexpected consequences, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel if you believe that small acts of compassion can change lives forever. Now let's rewind to see how a simple act of kindness on a freezing winter night changed everything for a young girl fighting against the odds. Zoe Washington woke up before dawn in the tiny bedroom she shared with her mother in their Riverside apartment. The heater had broken again, leaving frost patterns on the inside of the window. She could hear her mother coughing violently in the bathroom, a sound that had become frighteningly familiar over the past 3 weeks. At 16, Zoe carried responsibilities far beyond her years. Her mother, Diana Washington, had always worked multiple jobs to provide for them, primarily as a housekeeper for wealthy families in Oakwood Heights, the affluent suburb that stood in stark contrast to their own neglected neighborhood. But pneumonia had left Diana bedridden and unable to work, and their precarious financial situation was now in freefall. Zoe pulled on an extra sweater and checked their kitchen cabinet, finding only a half-empty box of cereal and some crackers. The refrigerator held little more than condiments and a carton of milk that was days past its expiration date. She made a mental calculation of the $37 left in her wallet against the growing stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen table. The latest one, printed in bold red letters, was a final notice of eviction. Despite their circumstances, Zoe maintained perfect grades at Westfield Academy, an elite school where she attended on an academic scholarship. The scholarship covered tuition but little else, leaving Zoe to navigate a world of privilege with second-hand uniforms, and without the expensive calculator and laptop her coursework demanded. After school each day, she worked at Sunset Burger in the Westfield Mall food court, walking 4 miles each way since the city had cut bus service to Riverside, claiming insufficient ridership despite community protests. The predominantly Black and Latino neighborhood had seen services systematically reduced over the years, from public transportation to road repairs to emergency response times. Zoe placed a cup of tea and some crackers beside her mother's bed before leaving, kissing her forehead gently. Diana stirred her dark skin ashen with illness. "You should stay home today, baby," she whispered, her voice raspy. "The weather report says a blizzard is coming." Zoe shook her head. "We need the money, Mom. My shift ends at 9, but I should be home by 10. She didn't mention the eviction notice or that she planned to ask her manager for additional hours. Diana grasped her daughter's hand weakly. "You shouldn't have to carry all this." Zoe squeezed back, forcing a smile. "Rest and get better. That's your only job right now." The walk to school took Zoe through stark visual evidence of Oakwood Heights prosperity versus Riverside neglect. The moment she crossed Martin Luther King Boulevard, the cracked sidewalks transformed into well-maintained pathways. Streetlights that had been broken for years in her neighborhood were all functional here, and snowplows had already cleared the roads. At Westfield Academy, Zoe slipped into her seat seconds before the bell, ignoring the whispers from a group of white students about her worn uniform and damp shoes. Her AP music theory teacher, Mrs. Holloway, a thin woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair, returned their essays with a flourish. "Exceptional analysis, as usual, Erica." She praised a blonde girl in the front row before dropping Zoe's paper on her desk with a curt, "Technically proficient, but lacking depth." Zoe bit her lip, looking down at the B- on her paper, despite answers identical to those Shed helped Erica formulate during their study session. During lunch, Zoe practiced piano in the music room, instead of saving her meal voucher for dinner. She was working on Chopin's revolutionary etude for the spring recital, her fingers flying over the keys with precision and passion. Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway, watching with narrowed eyes. "Your technique has improved, Zoe, but you still lack the natural refinement this piece demands. Perhaps something less ambitious would be more appropriate for someone of your background." The familiar sting of these microaggressions had become part of Zoe's daily life at Westfield. After school, she rushed to her shift at Sunset Burger, where the manager immediately criticized her for being 2 minutes late. The food court was busy with holiday shoppers, and Zoe worked without breaks serving customers who rarely made eye contact or thanked her. One woman complained that Zoe had attitude when she simply asked the customer to repeat her order during a loud moment. By the time her shift ended at 9, Zoe was exhausted, her feet throbbing in her worn sneakers. When she stepped outside, the promised blizzard had arrived with a vengeance. White snow swirled violently against the black sky, accumulating rapidly on the ground. Zoe pulled her thin jacket tighter, realizing with dismay that she'd missed the last bus home. With no money for a taxi and no one to call for a ride, she began the long walk to Riverside, each step heavier than the last, as the snow soaked through her inappropriate footwear and the temperature continued to drop dangerously. The wind whipped mercilessly around Zoe as she trudged through snowdrifts that reached halfway up her calves. Her thin gloves offered little protection, and she could no longer feel her fingertips. Visibility had deteriorated to the point where streetlights appeared as mere hazy glows in the swirling white darkness. She had reached Oakwood Park, the halfway point of her journey, when she noticed a figure sitting motionless on a bench partially buried in snow. As Zoe drew closer, she made out an elderly white man in an expensive-looking camel hair coat that was soaked through his bare head, covered with snow and thin leather dress shoes, completely inappropriate for the blizzard conditions. Despite his obviously costly attire, something seemed terribly wrong. The man stared vacantly ahead, shivering violently, making no attempt to seek shelter from the lethal cold. Zoe noticed other pedestrians actively avoiding him. A couple hurried past the woman, whispering loudly enough for Zoe to hear, "Probably another homeless drunk. Don't make eye contact." A businessman talked on his phone as he walked by, remarking to whoever was on the line, "The police should really clear these people out. Brings down the whole neighborhood." Their casual cruelty made Zoe's chest tighten with anger. She approached the bench cautiously, noting the man's blue-tinged lips and confused expression. "Sir, are you okay? You shouldn't be out here in this weather." The elderly man looked up at her with cloudy blue eyes that seemed unable to focus properly. Before he could respond, a police cruiser pulled up alongside the park, and an officer rolled down his window. "Step away from him, miss," the officer called out sternly. Zoe turned. "Hess freezing out here. He needs help." The officer, a middle-aged white man, exited his vehicle and approached with his hand resting on his belt. "I said, step away. Mind your own business." His tone made it clear he viewed her as a threat rather than someone trying to help. "These people from Riverside coming over here causing trouble," he muttered just loud enough for her to hear. Zoe recognized the implication immediately. The officer had made assumptions based solely on her race and worn clothing. She stood her ground despite her fear. "Hess elderly and confused. He needs medical attention." The officer glanced at the old man dismissively. "He'll be fine. Now move along before I have to take you in for loitering." He returned to his cruiser without offering any assistance, watching Zoe through the windshield. The injustice of the situation burned in Zoe's throat, but she knew from experience that arguing would only make things worse. She waited until the police car drove away before approaching the man again. "Sir, my name is Zoe." "Can you tell me your name?" The elderly man blinked slowly as if trying to remember. "Harold," he finally said, his voice cultured but weak. Harold. I need to get home, but I can't remember where." His confusion and the slight slurring of his words suggested to Zoe that he might be suffering from dementia, not intoxication, as others had assumed. Without hesitation, she unwrapped her only scarf from around her neck and gently placed it around his shoulders. "Let me help you, Harold. Do you have any identification with your address? Or someone we can call?" Harold patted his pockets with trembling hands. I don't know. Everything looks different in the snow. I was going somewhere important." Zoe spotted a coffee shop across the street that was still open. "Let's get you warmed up and then we'll figure out what to do." She helped Harold to his feet, alarmed at how unsteady he was. As they slowly made their way across the street, Harold leaning heavily on her slight frame, Zoe could see the shop employee watching them approach with growing alarm. When they reached the door, the employee quickly flipped the sign to closed and locked the door despite other customers clearly visible inside. Zoe knocked, pointing to Harold's condition, but the employee shook his head and drew the blinds. This scene repeated itself at 2 more establishments, with staff either locking doors or telling them outright that Harold looked like trouble and they didn't want any problems. One shop owner threatened to call the police if they didn't leave immediately. Zoe fought back tears of frustration, knowing exactly why they were being turned away. The sight of a young black girl with an elderly white man triggered racist assumptions about her intentions. With her last $8, Zoe bought 2 hot chocolates from a street vendor who seemed too busy to care who she was serving. She guided Harold to a covered bus shelter and helped him drink the warm liquid while she dialed 911 on her nearly dead phone. 911 what's your emergency, the dispatcher answered. With an elderly man who has dementia, I think. Hess extremely cold and confused. We need medical assistance. The dispatcher asked for their location, which Zoe provided, then asked for Harold's information. His name is Harold. That's all I know. He can't remember his address or last name. The dispatcher's tone changed slightly. And your relationship to him is? The implication was clear, and Zoe's patience frayed. A person who found him sitting alone in a blizzard while everyone else walked by. He needs help now. The dispatcher promised an ambulance was on the way but would be delayed due to weather conditions. After hanging up, Zoe realized they might be waiting for 30 minutes or more in temperatures well below freezing. Harold was already dangerously cold, and her own extremities were becoming numb. Making a quick decision, she removed her coat and wrapped it around Harold's shoulders, along with her scarf, leaving herself in just a sweater. No, child, Harold protested weakly. You'll freeze. Zoe shook her head, rubbing her arms vigorously. It'll be fine. Just keep talking to me, okay? Tell me about yourself. What kind of work did you do? Her teeth chattered as she spoke, but she maintained a calm, encouraging tone. Harold's eyes seemed to clear slightly. I was an engineer, built things, solved problems nobody else could solve. He spoke haltingly but with pride. Had my own company. Built it from nothing. Zoe nodded, keeping him engaged. That's amazing. What kind of things did you build? As Harold described innovations in technology she didn't fully understand, Zoe continued to rub his hands between hers, trying to restore circulation. She ignored her own discomfort, focusing entirely on keeping him awake and as warm as possible as they waited for help that seemed to be taking forever in the howling storm. 28 minutes later, the ambulance finally arrived, its lights cutting through the swirling snow like crimson beacons. 2 paramedics trudged through the deepening drifts, looking annoyed at being called out in such treacherous conditions. What's the situation here? The first paramedic asked, barely glancing at Zoe as he approached Harold. Zoe stood shivering violently in her thin sweater, having sacrificed her coat and scarf. I found him in the park. Hess confused and can't remember where he lives. I think he has dementia, and he's been out in this weather for hours. The second paramedic, a middle-aged woman, looked Harold over with cursory attention. Probably just another wanderer from the senior center. They really need to keep better track of their residents. She spoke as though Harold couldn't hear or comprehend her words. Let's get him loaded up and drop him at County General. They began to help Harold to his feet with rough efficiency rather than compassion, but as they moved his sleeve to check his blood pressure, a medical alert bracelet caught the light. The male paramedic leaned closer, his eyes widening, as he read the inscription. Holy shit, he whispered to his partner. This is Harold Montgomery. The female paramedic froze. Montgomery Technologies. Harold Montgomery. The billionaire Andeclay. Their entire demeanor transformed instantly. Suddenly, Harold was being treated with exquisite care, wrapped in thermal blankets, spoken to with deferential tones, and moved with gentle hands. Mr. Montgomery, sir, we're going to take excellent care of you. You're safe now, the male paramedic assured him. All traces of his previous annoyance vanished. Zoe watched this metamorphosis with a mixture of relief for Harold and disgust at their blatant display of selective humanity. The same police officer who had earlier dismissed Harold's plight and warned Zoe away now pulled up in his cruiser, lights flashing. He approached with an entirely different manner than before, respectful and concerned. "Mr. Montgomery, sir," Officer Daniels, "we've been looking everywhere for you. Your staff reported you missing hours ago." Then, turning to Zoe with sudden suspicion, he asked sharply, "What exactly are you doing with Mr. Montgomery?" The implication in his tone was unmistakable. He was suggesting she'd done something wrong. Before Zoe could defend herself, the officer continued, "Were these items taken from Mr. Montgomery?" He pointed to Harold's wrinkled hands, clutching Zoe's threadbare coat and scarf. Harold, who had been drifting in and out of lucidity, suddenly became agitated. "No. She gave them to me. She helped when no one else would. She stayed." His voice was stronger now, indignant on her behalf. The paramedics began loading Harold into the ambulance, while the officer continued to regard Zoe with open suspicion. "He'll need your full name and contact information. The family will want to know who was last with him." Zoe provided her details, knowing full well the officer suspected her of attempted exploitation rather than recognizing her act of compassion. As they prepared to close the ambulance doors, Harold became increasingly distressed. "The girl, she comes, too. I won't go without her." He tried to rise from the gurney, fighting against the straps and blankets. The paramedics exchanged glances, clearly reluctant to accommodate this request, but unwilling to upset their now identified VIP patient. "Fine," the female paramedic said tersely to Zoe. "You can ride along, but you'll have to stay in the waiting area at the hospital." Throughout the ride to Oakwood Heights Memorial Hospital, the city's most prestigious medical facility, Zoe sat silently in the front, while the paramedics radioed ahead about their high-priority patient. Upon arrival, they were met by a team of doctors and administrators in the emergency bay, all practically tripping over themselves to attend to Harold. Zoe was immediately separated from him and directed to a waiting area far from where Harold was taken. The contrast in treatment was impossible to miss the same hospital where her mother had waited 7 hours with pneumonia symptoms before being seen, now moved with extraordinary speed for a wealthy patient. After an hour of waiting, Zoe approached the reception desk to inquire about Harold's condition. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer. "Family only." "Are you family?" When Zoe explained the situation, the woman's response was curt. "Then you should probably go home, Mr. Montgomery is receiving the best care possible. Your presence isn't necessary." Another hour passed, during which Zoe witnessed the arrival of a well-dressed man in his 50s, surrounded by an entourage of lawyers and assistants. From the fragments of conversation she overheard, she gathered this was Richard Montgomery, Harold's son. Unlike his father, Richard exuded cold arrogance, demanding information from the hospital staff with barely contained impatience, and treating them as servants rather than professionals. Not once did he express concern for his father's well-being, only irritation at the inconvenience. "This is precisely why I've been pushing for full-time care. He's completely incapable of looking after himself," Richard said loudly to one of his lawyers. This episode should be enough to convince the court. As Richard and his entourage were escorted to the VIP section where Harold was being treated, Zoe heard Harold's voice raised in agitation from down the hallway. "Where is she? The kind girl who helped me. I want to see her." Richard's dismissive response carried clearly. "Dad, there was no girl. That's your confusion talking again. You wandered off from the house and got lost. The security team found you." This blatant lie made Zoe's blood boil, but she knew any protest would be futile and likely result in her being escorted out or worse. As the night wore on, Zoe realized she needed to get home to check on her mother. She was preparing to leave when a nurse in blue scrubs approached her quietly. "Are you Zoe?" the nurse asked, looking around to ensure no one was watching their interaction. When Zoe nodded, the nurse pressed something into her hand. "Mr. Montgomery was asking for you repeatedly. His son told us you were gone, but I thought, well, Mr. Montgomery wanted you to have this. He was quite insistent." In Zoe's palm lay an elegant business card with the Montgomery Technologies logo embossed in gold. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for your kindness, Harold Montgomery." The nurse squeezed her shoulder gently. "What you did tonight, not many people would have stopped to help. You should know that." This small acknowledgement of her humanity brought unexpected tears to Zoe's eyes. By the time she finally made it home, it was past midnight. The apartment was freezing cold, and her mother's cough sounded worse. When Zoe turned on the light, she saw what she had dreaded the most, an official eviction notice taped to their door, giving them 72 hours to vacate the premises. What do you think about the way Zoe was treated compared to Harold once his identity was revealed? Comment number 1. If you believe the paramedics and officers should be held accountable for their discriminatory behavior, or number 2, if you think their reaction was just human nature when dealing with someone wealthy and powerful. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that reveal the reality of prejudice in America. Now, what do you think will happen next? Will Zoe ever see Harold again, or will Richard make sure they never cross paths? Let's find out. The next morning, Zoe woke up with a fever and chills, her body finally succumbing to the hours spent in the blizzard without adequate protection. Despite her condition, she tried to prepare for school, knowing that perfect attendance was a condition of her scholarship. Diana, however, took one look at her daughter and firmly shook her head. "Not today, Zoe. You can barely stand." For once, Zoe didn't argue. She collapsed back into bed as her mother, still weak herself, called the school to report her absence. Later that afternoon, as Zoe drifted in and out of feverish sleep, Diana sat beside her bed with a worried expression. "Your school counselor called back. He said this absence could affect your scholarship status since it's your third missed day this year." Zoe's stomach twisted with anxiety. The previous 2 absences had been when she stayed home to care for her mother at the height of her pneumonia. The scholarship committee had warned her then about the attendance policy, explaining that it demonstrated commitment and responsibility. The policy made no allowances for family emergencies or illness without expensive doctor's notes they couldn't afford. He also mentioned something strange. Diana continued, her brow furrowed. He said, "There are rumors circulating about you claiming to have rescued a billionaire during the blizzard. He seemed concerned that you might be creating stories for attention." Zoe sat up despite her dizziness. What Diana showed her a smartphone with a social media post, displaying a blurry photo taken from inside the coffee shop that had locked them out. The caption read, "Saw Montgomery Technologies CEO being manipulated by some girl from Riverside last night. Security came just in time. Number gold digger fail." The post had thousands of shares and comments, most assuming the worst about Zoe's intentions. Some commenters had even identified her school uniform in the photo and tagged Westfield Academy. "This is insane," Zoe whispered, scrolling through the vicious comments speculating about her targeting Harold. Many included racist insinuations about her motives, with several suggesting she should be arrested for elder exploitation. When Zoe finally returned to school 2 days later, the whispers followed her through the hallways. Students who had never spoken to her before suddenly had pointed questions about her billionaire boyfriend and whether she thought she was going to get rich quick. Even teachers seemed to view her with new suspicion, particularly Mrs. Holloway, who made a show of moving her purse closer when Zoe entered the music room for her practice session. During lunch, Zoe was called to Mr. Davis's office. As one of the few black faculty members at Westfield Academy, she had hoped he might be an ally, but his expression was stern as she sat across from his desk. "Zoe, I need to address these rumors circulating about you and Harold Montgomery." His tone was professional but distinctly cool. "Several parents have called expressing concern about the story you're telling." Zoe's frustration boiled over. "It's not a story. I found him alone in the snow. I helped him because it was the right thing to do, and now everyone's acting like I committed a crime." Mr. Davis sighed, removing his glasses to pinch the bridge of his nose. "Look, Zoe, I understand the pressure you're under. Your mother's illness, your financial situation, these are difficult circumstances. But fabricating connections to wealthy individuals is not the answer. The betrayal of being disbelieved by someone who should have understood cut deeply." "Check with Oakwood Heights Memorial," she said quietly. "They have the records of my arrival with him in the ambulance. Ask Officer Daniels from Oakwood Heights PD. He took my information at the scene." "Mr." Davis's expression softened slightly, but his words remained cautionary. Even if there was an encounter, I'm concerned about how you're characterizing it. The Montgomery family is extremely powerful in this city. If they feel you're using this incident for personal gain or attention, they could make things very difficult for you and potentially for the school. Your scholarship could be at risk. Meanwhile, across town in the Montgomery estate, a very different conversation was taking place. Richard Montgomery sat in his father's study, reviewing documents with a team of attorneys. "The neurologist's report is perfect," he said, sliding the paper into a folder. "Combined with this incident, we have everything we need for the competency hearing next month." One of the attorneys nodded. "The petition is ready to file. Once your father is declared legally incompetent, you'll have full control of his financial and medical decisions as already established in the contingency planning documents." Richard allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. It's for his own good. He's clearly deteriorating, rapidly wandering off talking nonsense about charitable initiatives that would devastate our profit margins. In another wing of the sprawling mansion, Harold Montgomery sat in a sunroom, gazing out at the snow-covered gardens, with a distant expression. His personal assistant of 20 years, Victoria Chen, sat beside him, reviewing his schedule on a tablet. Unlike the medical professionals who had written him off as completely confused, Victoria recognized that Harold's condition was more nuanced. He experienced periods of disorientation, certainly, but also had stretches of remarkable mental clarity, particularly when discussing topics that engaged his interest. "Sir," she said gently, "would you like to review the quarterly reports today, or shall we save that for tomorrow?" Harold turned to her, his blue eyes suddenly sharp and present. "Victoria, I need you to find her." Victoria didn't need to ask who he meant. Harold had mentioned the kind girl with the scarf repeatedly since his return home. "The young black girl who helped me when everyone else walked by. I need to thank her properly." Victoria hesitated. "Mr. Montgomery, your son has advised against pursuing this matter. He's concerned that this individual might try to take advantage of your generosity." Harold's expression hardened a glimpse of the formidable businessman he had once been flashing through. "Richard doesn't make decisions for me. Not yet." He reached for a notepad and wrote with slightly trembling hands. "Her name is Zoe. She's a student at Westfield Academy. Find her, Victoria. That's an order." Victoria recognized the tone that had built a technology empire. Despite her concerns about defying Richard, her loyalty to Harold ran deeper. "I'll locate her, sir." True to her word, Victoria used the Montgomery resources to identify and locate Zoe Washington within hours. What she discovered troubled her deeply records of an outstanding student with perfect grades facing eviction with her ill mother, working a minimum wage job while maintaining a full academic scholarship. This didn't match the opportunistic character Richard had described. After confirming Zoe's schedule through contacts at Westfield Academy, Victoria waited in an unmarked car outside Sunset Burger at the end of Zoe's shift. As the exhausted teenager emerged from the service entrance, Victoria approached her. "Excuse me, Zoe Washington. My name is Victoria Chen. I work for Harold Montgomery." Zoe immediately stiffened wariness, evident in her posture. "If you're here to threaten me with legal action or whatever, save it. I didn't do anything wrong." Victoria shook her head. "On the contrary, Mr. Montgomery has been asking for you. He'd like to thank you personally for your assistance during his episode." Zoe's expression registered shock, followed quickly by suspicion. "His son made it pretty clear I wasn't welcome." Victoria smiled slightly. "Mr. Montgomery and his son don't always see eye to eye. I've been instructed to bring you to the estate if you're willing." Zoe hesitated, visibly torn. On one hand, the invitation offered possible closure to the bizarre incident that had turned her life upside down. On the other hand, she couldn't help but worry about walking into a situation controlled by Richard Montgomery, who had already shown his willingness to lie and manipulate. Yet beneath these concerns lay a more pressing reality. The prescription for her mother's antibiotics was sitting in her backpack unfilled because they couldn't afford the $76 the pharmacy demanded. Their eviction was scheduled for tomorrow morning. Desperation tipped the scales. "I need to check on my mother first," she finally said. Victoria nodded understanding. "Of course. We can stop at your home first, and you can explain the situation to her. My car is this way." Victoria's sleek black luxury sedan seemed jarringly out of place in Riverside, drawing stares as it navigated the potholed streets. Inside the warm vehicle, Zoe sat rigid with tension, hyper-aware of the vast disparity between her reality and the world she was about to enter. "My mother probably won't approve of this," she admitted, as they approached her apartment building. "She's very protective." Victoria's expression remained neutral. "Would you prefer I speak with her? I can explain, Mr. Montgomery's intentions." Zoe considered this before nodding. That might help. The apartment was cold when they entered the heating, still malfunctioning despite multiple complaints to the landlord. Diana Washington was sitting at their small kitchen table, surrounded by past-due notices, her face drawn with worry. She looked up in surprise at the elegant Asian woman who followed her daughter through the door. Victoria introduced herself with professional courtesy, explaining Harold's desire to thank Zoe personally. Diana listened with increasing skepticism. "So a billionaire wants to meet my 16-year-old daughter alone at his estate. I'm sorry, but that sounds inappropriate regardless of his intentions." Victoria acknowledged her concern. "You're absolutely welcome to accompany us, Miss Washington. Mr. Montgomery would be pleased to thank you as well for raising such a compassionate daughter." Diana glanced at Zoe, who was trying to hide her eagerness. Despite her misgivings, Diana could see what this validation meant to her daughter after days of being disbelieved and ridiculed. "I can't leave the apartment. The landlord is coming for final inspection before eviction tomorrow." The admission clearly cost her pride. Zoe seized the opportunity. "Mom, please. This could be my chance to clear my name. Everyone at school thinks I made this whole thing up." After further discussion and Victoria's assurance that she would personally guarantee Zoe's safety, Diana reluctantly agreed, but with conditions. "She needs to be home by 9, and I want regular text updates." Diana pulled Zoe aside as they prepared to leave, pressing something into her hand. "Keep this with you," she whispered. It was a small can of pepper spray, their sole protection in a neighborhood where police response times averaged 45 minutes, just in case. The drive to Oakwood Heights took them through progressively more affluent neighborhoods until they reached a private road lined with ancient oak trees. A massive wrought-iron gate swung open as they approached, revealing the Montgomery estate, a sprawling mansion that looked more like a small hotel than a private residence. Zoe tried to mask her awe as they pulled up to the entrance where livened staff stood waiting. As they exited the car, a security guard approached, his gaze fixed suspiciously on Zoe. "I'll need to see some identification and search her bag," he said to Victoria, not addressing Zoe directly. Victoria frowned. "That won't be necessary, Robert. Miss Washington is here at Mr. Montgomery's personal invitation." The security guard persisted. "New protocols from Mr. Richard, ma'am. All visitors must be screened." Reluctantly, Zoe handed over her student ID and allowed him to search her worn backpack, her cheeks burning with humiliation as he rifled through her personal belongings, including the medication prescription she hadn't been able to fill. His expression remained suspicious even after finding nothing of concern. "You can go in, but I'll need to escort you at all times." Victoria's usually composed demeanor showed a flash of irritation. "That won't be necessary. I'll take full responsibility for Miss Washington's visit." She guided Zoe inside, murmuring an apology as they entered the grand foyer with its soaring ceilings and marble floors. "Richard has implemented several new security measures recently, ostensibly for his father's protection." Zoe nodded, trying to appear unaffected, though the guard's treatment had stung. They found Harold in a sunlit conservatory, filled with exotic plants, a space larger than Zoe's entire apartment. Despite being surrounded by luxury, the elderly man appeared smaller and more fragile than she remembered, sitting in an expensive wheelchair with a blanket across his legs. When he looked up and saw Zoe, however, his entire demeanor transformed. "It's you, the angel from the snowstorm," he exclaimed, his face lighting up with genuine joy. "Victoria, you found her." He extended his hands toward Zoe, who approached hesitantly. "Sir, I'm glad to see you're doing better." Harold clasped her hands warmly. "Thanks to you, my dear. You saved my life that night. The doctors said I would have succumbed to hypothermia within the hour if you hadn't stayed with me." He studied her face. "But you're not wearing your scarf. Or your coat." Zoe shifted uncomfortably. "They were taken as evidence by the hospital, I think." Harold frowned. "Unacceptable. Victoria, make a note to replace those items immediately." He patted the chair beside him. "Sit, please. Tell me about yourself." What followed was the most surreal dinner experience of Zoe's life. She sat at a formal dining table longer than a bus, surrounded by priceless art, and served by staff who watched her with barely concealed curiosity. Harold insisted she sit at his right hand, listening with genuine interest as she reluctantly shared details about her life, her mother's illness, her scholarship at Westfield Academy, her passion for piano. Each time she used the wrong fork or hesitated over the unfamiliar menu items, Harold gently guided her without drawing attention to her discomfort. Throughout the meal, she was acutely aware of the staff's whispers and sideways glances. She overheard one server murmur to another, "That's the girl from the news, probably trying to get written into the will." Another replied, "Mr. Richard is going to have a fit when he finds out she's here." As if summoned by these whispers, the dining room doors suddenly burst open, and Richard Montgomery strode in, his face flushed with anger. Behind him trailed two men in expensive suits, clutching leather portfolios. "What the hell is going on here?" Richard demanded, glaring at Victoria before turning his cold gaze on Zoe. "Who authorized this person's presence in our home?" Harold straightened in his chair, a flash of the formidable CEO he once was breaking through his frail exterior. "I did, Richard. Miss Washington is here as my honored guest." Richard's smile was razor-thin and didn't reach his eyes. "Father, you're confused again. This girl took advantage of your condition. She's obviously here to exploit your generosity." He turned to Zoe. "Whatever you're hoping to gain from this little performance, it won't work. My father's condition makes him vulnerable to manipulation, especially from people like you." The racial undertone in "people like you" was impossible to miss. Zoe began to stand, her cheeks burning with humiliation. "I should go." Harold's hand on her arm stopped her. "You will do no such thing," he said firmly before addressing his son. "Richard, you forget yourself, and you forget who built this company and who still owns controlling interest." His voice had taken on a strength and clarity that seemed to surprise everyone in the room. "Miss Washington showed me kindness when your own security team couldn't locate me for hours. She sacrificed her coat and scarf in a blizzard, while businesses refused us entry, and a police officer threatened her instead of helping." Richard scoffed. "Dramatic stories to build sympathy. Classic manipulation tactics." Harold's eyes narrowed. "Like the manipulation tactics you used to divert $3 million from the Montgomery Foundation last quarter, or the board members you bribed to support your hostile takeover attempt last year." A stunned silence fell over the room. Even Richard seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Harold turned to Zoe, his manner gentler, but still commanding. "Miss Washington, I'd like to offer you a position as my personal companion. Your kindness, intelligence, and character are exactly what I need in my daily life. The salary would be $80,000 annually, with full benefits and a flexible schedule to accommodate your education." Zoe gasped, the figure representing more money than her mother made in 3 years. It would solve their financial crisis instantly. Before she could respond, Richard recovered his composure. "This is precisely why you need full-time care, Father. Your judgment is completely impaired, offering a fortune to some ghetto girl you met once. The board will hear about this latest episode." He snapped his fingers at one of his lawyers. "Document everything for the competency hearing." He then fixed Zoe with a threatening stare. "As for you, I suggest you leave immediately, before I have security escort you out and file charges for trespassing and elder exploitation." Zoe looked between father and son, witnessing a power struggle she hadn't anticipated and didn't want to exacerbate. Despite desperately needing the opportunity Harold offered, she couldn't bear the thought of becoming a pawn in their family conflict. With tremendous effort, she steadied her voice. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm deeply honored by your offer. Your generosity is incredible. but I can't accept a position that would cause such conflict in your family." Harold began to protest, but Zoe continued gently. "The kindness you've shown by simply believing in me means more than any job. Thank you for that gift." She stood dignity intact, despite the tears threatening to spill. "I should go now." Victoria moved to accompany her, but Richard intercepted them. "My assistant will see her out. You and I need to discuss your continued employment, Miss Chen, after this breach of protocol." As Zoe was escorted to the front door, she could hear Harold's raised voice still arguing with his son. The assistant who walked her out, a young woman with sympathetic eyes, pressed something into Zoe's hand just before she left. "Mr. Montgomery insisted," she whispered. "Don't let Mr. Richard know." Outside in the cold night air, Zoe opened her palm to find an envelope containing $5,000 in cash and a handwritten note for your mother's medicine and your immediate needs. "This isn't charity, but recognition of a debt I can never fully repay. H.M." Despite the generous amount, Zoe stood at the gate of the massive estate, feeling more defeated than triumphant, tears finally spilling down her cheeks as she contemplated the long walk home in the dark. 3 days later, the front page of the Oakwood Gazette featured a photograph of Zoe leaving the Montgomery estate alongside a sensationalized headline, "Teen Targets Tech Billionaire in Elder Exploitation Scheme." The article, clearly sourced from Richard Montgomery's camp, painted Zoe as a calculating opportunist who had manipulated a confused elderly man for financial gain. It mentioned her troubled family background and insinuated that Diana Washington had a criminal record, though no specific charges were cited. By the time Zoe arrived at school, the story had spread like wildfire. Students openly stared and whispered as she walked through the hallways. Even teachers, who had previously been supportive, now regarded her with suspicion. During her morning class, a notification appeared on her phone. A friend had sent her a link to a local news segment where Richard Montgomery stood outside his company headquarters, presenting himself as a concerned son protecting his place, R8. Vulnerable father from predatory individuals targeting wealthy seniors. His carefully worded statement never named Zoe directly, but included enough details that anyone familiar with the situation would know exactly who he meant. By lunchtime, Zoe was called to the administrative office, where the principal, Dr. Harrington, and Mr. Davis waited with grave expressions. "Zoe, in light of recent developments and the attention you've attracted to Westfield Academy, we need to discuss your scholarship status." Dr. Harrington began, not quite meeting her eyes. "Mr. Davis at least had the decency to look uncomfortable as the principal continued. "The scholarship committee feels that your recent behavior doesn't align with the values and standards expected of Westfield scholarship recipients." Zoe stared in disbelief. "My behavior? You mean helping an elderly man during a blizzard or refusing an inappropriate job offer that would have solved all my family's financial problems?" Dr. Harrington's expression hardened. "Young lady, the Montgomery family has been major benefactors to this institution for 3 generations. Richard Montgomery personally endowed our new science wing last year. We have only his word and considerable evidence that you attempted to take advantage of his father's diminished mental state." Zoe's hands shook with anger and hurt. "Have you tried speaking with Harold Montgomery directly? Or is Richard's money enough to make you assume the worst about me without investigation?" The question hung in the air, its implication too accurate for comfort. "Mr. Davis cleared his throat. "Zoe, no official decision has been made yet. Consider this a warning that your scholarship is under review. In the meantime, Mrs. Holloway has suggested it might be best if you didn't participate in the spring recital given the emotional strain you must be under." This additional blow nearly broke Zoe's composure. The spring recital was her opportunity to perform for college scouts from Juilliard and other prestigious music programs, her best chance at scholarships for higher education. Being removed was effectively sabotaging her future. That afternoon, Zoe practiced piano alone in the music room during her free period, pouring her frustration and heartbreak into Chopin's revolutionary etude. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice Mrs. Holloway standing in the doorway until the teacher spoke. Your technique remains impressive, Zoe, but I've decided Anna will be performing the Chopin piece at the recital. Zoe's fingers froze over the keys. Anna can barely handle Mozart. She's not ready for Chopin. Mrs. Holloway's smile was thin. Perhaps not with your technical precision, but she has the emotional maturity the piece requires. Recent events have demonstrated that you lack judgment. The implication was clear. Zoe's association with the Montgomery scandal had cost her this opportunity, regardless of her superior musical abilities. "This isn't fair," Zoe said quietly. Mrs. Holloway adjusted her pearl necklace. "Life rarely is. You should have considered the consequences of your actions more carefully." As she turned to leave, she added, "Oh, and please limit your practice time to 30 minutes per day going forward. Other students need access to the piano." Meanwhile, at Montgomery Technologies headquarters, Richard was in his father's former office, now effectively his own meeting with the company's public relations team. "The press coverage is working in our favor," the head of PR reported. "Public sympathy is solidly with you as the concerned son. We've emphasized your father's condition without explicitly detailing it, which maintains his dignity while supporting the narrative that he's being taken advantage of." Richard nodded approvingly. "Excellent." And the girl, the PR director, consulted his tablet. "Completely discredited. We've successfully created doubt about her motives without making direct accusations that could lead to legal issues." The implication of her mother's non-existent criminal background was particularly effective. No one's bothered to verify it, but it colors public perception. Richard smiled. "Perfect. Now we need to accelerate the legal proceedings. I want the competency hearing moved up if possible." Across town, Harold Montgomery suffered a minor heart attack following a heated argument with Richard about the newspaper article. He was admitted to Oakwood Heights Memorial, where Richard immediately restricted his visitors to an approved list that Victoria Chen barely managed to get herself included on. Harold, though physically weakened, remained mentally alert enough to recognize that his son was systematically isolating him. "Victoria," he whispered, when they were briefly alone, "find Zoe Washington again. And look into what Richard's done to her. He wouldn't have stopped at the newspaper." Victoria nodded, already anticipating Richard's fury if he discovered her actions. "I'll do what I can, sir." Her investigation led her to Riverside just as Zoe and her mother were being evicted from their apartment. Diana, still weak from pneumonia, sat on the curb beside their meager possessions, while Zoe argued desperately with the landlord. "We just need another week," Zoe pleaded. "My mother isn't well enough to move." The landlord remained unmoved. "Not my problem. I've got new tenants moving in tomorrow, paying $100 more per month. Business is business." Victoria approached cautiously, taking in the scene. "Miss Washington." Both Zoe and Diana looked up. "I need to speak with you about Harold Montgomery. He's had a heart attack." Zoe's expression shifted from desperation to genuine concern. "Is he okay?" Victoria hesitated. "Physically, he's stabilizing, but Richard has essentially placed him under house arrest. No visitors, controlled medication, restricted communication." She glanced at their belongings on the curb. "I see Richard's influence has reached you as well." Diana straightened despite her exhaustion. "That man spread lies about my daughter and me in the newspaper. Suddenly the apartment we've lived in for 8 years is no longer available to us, and Zoe's scholarship is under review." Victoria wasn't surprised. That fits his pattern. Richard views anyone with influence over his father as a threat to his inheritance. She hesitated before continuing. "There's something you should know about Harold and why your kindness affected him so deeply." She invited them to a nearby diner, where over coffee she revealed Harold's hidden history. Harold had a daughter named Elizabeth from his first marriage. She died when she was 7 years old. Zoe looked up sharply. "I never read anything about that in the articles about him." Victoria nodded. "It's not public knowledge. Harold made sure of that." Elizabeth became ill with appendicitis in 1978. Harold and his wife took her to the nearest hospital, which turned them away because a black child was being treated in their emergency room, and they didn't want to upset their white patients by treating another child in the South. The same facility. Zoe and Diana exchanged horrified glances as Victoria continued. By the time they found another hospital willing to treat a white child alongside black patients, Elizabeth's appendix had ruptured. She died from sepsis. The parallels to Zoe's act of kindness across racial lines were unmistakable. After Elizabeth's death, Harold's first wife couldn't cope with the loss. They divorced, and he later married Richard's mother. But Harold never forgot what happened. He spent millions anonymously funding scholarships and healthcare initiatives in underserved communities. He established the Montgomery Foundation specifically to address racial disparities in medical treatment. Victoria pulled out a tablet and showed them documents detailing the foundation's work, funding free clinics in predominantly black neighborhoods, scholarships for minority medical students, and legal advocacy for healthcare. Discrimination cases. Richard has been systematically undermining these initiatives since he became COO 5 years ago. He's diverted funds, closed programs, and pushed the foundation toward more prestigious projects that generate positive PR but do little for actual community needs. Zoe studied the documents, a new understanding dawning. That's why Harold reacted so strongly when Richard called me. Victoria nodded grimly. A ghetto girl. Yes, Richard represents everything Harold has spent decades fighting against. And now Richard is using his father's occasional mental confusion to seize control of everything, including the foundation. Diana leaned forward. But why are you telling us this? What can we possibly do? Victoria looked directly at Zoe. Harold wants to restructure the leadership of both his company and foundation before Richard can complete the legal maneuvers to have him declared incompetent. He wants your input, Zoe, because you've experienced firsthand the inequalities his foundation was created to address. You represent exactly the kind of voice that Richard has been systematically excluding. Zoe blinked in surprise. Me, I'm 16. I don't know anything about running foundations or companies. Victoria smiled slightly. Harold doesn't expect you to run anything. He wants your perspective to help shape the future direction before he hands control to experienced professionals who share his vision, not Richard's greed. She became serious again. But we need to act quickly. Richard is accelerating his plans, and Harold's health crisis plays directly into his hands. As they discussed possibilities, Diana's phone rang with an unknown number. The call was brief, leaving her visibly shaken. That was the hospital. My latest test results came back. The pneumonia has developed complications. They want me admitted immediately. The timing couldn't have been worse. They had no home to return to, nowhere to store their belongings, and no way to pay for extended medical care. Victoria made a quick decision. I have a guest house on my property. You can stay there while we figure this out, and Harold's personal physician can review your case, Diana. Zoe looked at her mother, torn between desperation and pride. Diana squeezed her daughter's hand. Sometimes accepting help is the strongest thing you can do, especially when it serves a greater purpose than just ourselves. She turned to Victoria. We accept your offer, but only if Zoe and I can contribute to Harold's cause. We won't be charity cases. Victoria nodded with respect. Harold would expect nothing less. Do you think Zoe should help Harold restructure his company and foundation, knowing the risks Richard poses? Comment number 1, if you believe she should take this stand against injustice, despite the dangers, or number 2, if you think she should focus on her education and let Harold fight his own battles. Like and subscribe if you're enjoying this story of courage in the face of discrimination. What revelations do you think await Zoe as she delves deeper into the Montgomery family's world? Will her involvement help expose Richard's corruption, or will it give him more ammunition to use against her? Let's continue, and stopperdivox.com. Find out. The guest house on Victoria's property was modest by Oakwood Heights standards, but felt palatial compared to the Washingtons' apartment. For the first time in weeks, Diana had a comfortable place to recover, with proper heating and no mold-infested walls aggravating her respiratory condition. Dr. Abernathy, Harold's personal physician, visited within hours of their arrival, providing a thorough examination and prescribing more effective medications than what the overworked doctors at the public hospital had offered. Your mother's condition was misdiagnosed, he explained to Zoe after the examination. She has an atypical presentation of bronchiectasis, not just recurring pneumonia. With proper treatment, she should see significant improvement within weeks. Victoria had arranged for their belongings to be stored and provided immediate necessities, but both Zoe and Diana insisted on maintaining as much independence as possible. Zoe continued attending school despite the increasingly hostile environment, keeping her head high, even as whispers followed her through the hallways. When Richard discovered that Victoria had taken in the Washingtons, his reaction was swift and vindictive. He called an emergency board meeting at Montgomery Technologies, presenting a motion to terminate Victoria's employment on grounds of conflicting loyalties and breach of confidentiality. The board, largely composed of Richard's allies, seemed poised to approve the motion until an unexpected interruption occurred. Harold Montgomery, against medical advice, and with the help of a sympathetic nurse, had discharged himself from the hospital and arrived at the boardroom door, just as the vote was about to be taken. "I believe you're discussing the future of my most loyal employee," Harold said, his voice weaker than before, but his presence commanding immediate attention. "A discussion that seems to have been deliberately scheduled during my hospitalization." The boardroom fell silent as Harold made his way to the head of the table with the assistance of a cane. Richard recovered first, his concern for appearances overriding his anger. "Father, you should be resting. Your doctors have been frantic since your unauthorized departure." Harold fixed his son with a steady gaze. "Interesting choice of words, Richard. Unauthorized. As if I need permission to move about in my own life." He addressed the board directly. "Victoria Chen has served this company with distinction for 20 years. Any action against her employment would require my direct approval, as CEO and majority shareholder positions I still hold, despite recent rumors about my capacity." The pointed reference to Richard's competency challenge hung in the air. One board member, Dr. Lakshmi Patel, a respected technologist who had worked with Harold since the company's early days, spoke up. "Harold, it's wonderful to see you. Perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on this matter directly." This opening was exactly what Harold needed. For the next 30 minutes, he demonstrated a command of company operations and financials that belied any suggestion of incompetence, methodically dismantling Richard's case against Victoria, while revealing his son's pattern of undermining company values for personal gain. By the time he finished, the mood in the boardroom had shifted perceptibly. The motion against Victoria was tabled indefinitely, and several board members were casting doubtful glances at Richard, clearly reconsidering their alliances. Meanwhile, Zoe faced challenges of her own at Westfield Academy. Her removal from the spring recital had been finalized, with Anna rather smugly taking her place at the piano during rehearsals. But an unexpected ally emerged in the form of Miss Time Sesh Rodriguez, the history teacher who had assigned a semester project on corporate social responsibility. Students will research a major corporation and evaluate its ethics, community impact, and leadership practices, she announced to the class. Given the current local interest, Montgomery Technologies is an excellent subject for analysis. She looked directly at Zoe. "In fact, Zoe, your unique perspective might be valuable to classmates studying this topic." This subtle validation from a respected teacher didn't go unnoticed. Several students, including some who had previously avoided Zoe, approached her after class, seeking insights for their projects. The obvious smear campaign against her had begun to backfire, causing more thoughtful students to question the narrative Richard had crafted. One such student was James Chen, Victoria's nephew, and one of Westfield's top debaters. "The timeline doesn't make sense," he said to Zoe as they compared notes in the library. "If you were trying to exploit Mr. Montgomery, why would you refuse a high-paying job offer, and why would Victoria Chen risk her career to help you?" As word spread about Harold's unexpected appearance at the board meeting, demonstrating his mental acuity, more cracks appeared in Richard's carefully constructed narrative. Mr. Davis, the counselor who had warned Zoe about her scholarship status, requested a private meeting with her. "I owe you an apology," he said directly. "I allowed external pressure to cloud my judgment instead of supporting a student who needed an advocate." He slid a folder across his desk. These are records I've compiled documenting patterns of discriminatory treatment at Westfield, including the scholarship committee's history of holding minority students to different standards than their white counterparts." Zoe looked up in surprise, and Mr. Davis continued, "If Mr. Montgomery is genuinely interested in addressing systemic inequalities, this information might be useful to his foundation's educational initiatives. And it might help protect other students from what you've experienced." With growing support from unexpected quarters, Zoe began working with Victoria to help Harold prepare for the upcoming competency hearing. Using her research skills honed through years of academic excellence, she helped compile evidence of Richard's misconduct. Victoria's connections within Montgomery Technologies provided access to internal documents, while Zoe's experience navigating discriminatory systems offered crucial insights into how Richard had been systematically undermining his father's equality initiatives. Through Harold's medical team, they discovered that Richard had been pushing for his father to receive unnecessarily high doses of medication that caused confusion and lethargy, creating artificial symptoms of mental decline that supported his competency challenge. More disturbing were the documents they uncovered revealing Richard's collaboration with Oakwood Heights officials to prevent infrastructure improvements in Riverside and other minority neighborhoods. "It's part of a deliberate gentrification scheme," Victoria explained as they reviewed the evidence. "Montgomery Technologies needs land for their new headquarters expansion. By keeping Riverside under-resourced and driving property values down, they can buy the land, cheaply force out current residents, and redevelop at enormous profit." Zoe thought of her former neighbors, hard-working families who had lived in Riverside for generations, now being systematically pushed out through neglect and manipulation of city resources. This is why the bus routes were cut, she realized, and why the road repairs never happened, even though they were approved in the budget 3 years ago. Diana, whose health had improved significantly under proper care, joined their strategy sessions, offering her perspective as someone who had worked in wealthy Oakwood Heights homes for years. "The families I clean for talk openly about improving the neighborhood, by which they mean removing people who look like us. They don't realize I hear everything while I'm polishing their silver." As they built their case against Richard Harold's legal team, prepared for the competency hearing gathering medical experts who could testify to his mental capacity and the inappropriate medication regimen Richard had been pushing. The night before the hearing, Zoe sat with Harold in Victoria's garden discussing their strategy one final time. "Are you nervous?" she asked him, noting the slight tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with his condition. Harold considered the question thoughtfully. "Not for myself," he finally said. "I've lived a long life, built something meaningful. What Richard doesn't understand is that wealth means nothing if it isn't used to create positive change." He looked at Zoe with genuine admiration. "You remind me so much of Elizabeth. Not just your kindness, but your courage. She would have fought injustice just as fiercely as you do." Zoe felt the weight of this comparison to his long-lost daughter. "I'm honored that you think so, but tomorrow isn't about me or Elizabeth. It's about preserving your vision for equality." Harold smiled, a hint of his former strategic brilliance glinting in his eyes. "Actually, my dear, tomorrow is about much more than that. Richard believes he's fighting for control of a company and a fortune. What he doesn't realize is that he's about to face a reckoning for every person he's ever stepped on to get what he wants." The old man's certainty gave Zoe confidence. Despite her youth and the powerful forces aligned against them, she felt ready for the battle ahead, strengthened by the knowledge that they fought, not just for Harold's legacy, but for everyone Richard's greed and prejudice had harmed. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when Zoe arrived with Victoria and Diana the following morning. Montgomery Technologies, employees, reporters, and curious members of the public filled every available seat, creating an atmosphere of tense anticipation. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table surrounded by a team of expensive lawyers, looking confident in a perfectly tailored suit. He barely glanced at Zoe as she entered, dismissing her presence as irrelevant to the proceedings. Harold was already seated at the defense table, appearing frailer than usual, but impeccably dressed, his eyes alert and focused. The judge, Clayton Burrows, was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, whom Victoria had quietly informed them was a former golfing partner of Richard's. This connection didn't bode well for impartiality, but they had few options for venue change on such short notice. As the hearing began, Richard's lead attorney presented their case with polished efficiency, describing Harold as a brilliant man whose declining health has sadly affected his judgment and decision-making capacity. He introduced affidavits from several doctors, recommending full-time supervised care, and presented cherry-picked incidents of confusion as evidence of Harold's inability to manage his affairs. Most concerning the attorney continued smoothly is Mr. Montgomery's recent fixation on a teenage girl from an underprivileged background, offering her extraordinary financial opportunities after a single brief encounter demonstrating impaired risk assessment and vulnerability to manipulation. At this, several heads turned toward Zoe, who maintained a dignified expression despite the humiliation of being characterized as a predator taking advantage of an elderly man's confusion. Richard's team called their first witness Mrs. Holloway from Westfield Academy, who described Zoe as a student with a history of seeking special treatment and bending rules for personal advantage. When questioned about specific incidents, however, she could only cite Zoe's inappropriate ambition in choosing challenging musical pieces beyond what Mrs. Holloway considered suitable for a scholarship student from her background. Next came the school administrators, who testified about Zoe's supposed pattern of dishonesty, though under cross-examination they were forced to admit that her academic record was impeccable and no disciplinary actions had ever once been taken against her prior to the Montgomery incident. The strategy became clear. Richard was attempting to discredit Zoe, first establishing her as an untrustworthy influence in order to support his claims about his father's impaired judgment. By midday, the courtroom atmosphere had grown increasingly tense. Judge Burrows frequently sustained objections from Richard's attorneys, while overruling similar objections from Harold's team, displaying a bias that was difficult to miss. During a lunch recess, Harold's lead attorney, Elaine Johnson, conferred with him, Victoria, and Zoe in a private conference room. "The judge is clearly favoring Richard's team," she stated frankly. "We need to change our approach." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Let Zoe testify next. It's time to shift the narrative." Elaine looked skeptical. "That's risky. Richard's team has already worked to undermine her credibility." Harold's expression remained resolute. "Trust me on this. Zoe's testimony is essential to what comes next." When court reconvened, Harold's team called Zoe to the stand. As she walked forward, she felt the weight of every stare in the room. After being sworn in, she sat with her back straight, meeting the gaze of Harold's attorney with composed dignity. "Miss Washington," Elaine began, "please describe for the court your first encounter with Harold Montgomery." Zoe recounted the blizzard night in clear, measured terms, describing Harold's confusion, the dismissive treatment from passers-by, businesses, and the police officer, and her decision to help despite these obstacles. She neither embellished nor downplayed her actions, simply presenting the facts with straightforward honesty. "And when you later learned Mr. Montgomery's identity, did you attempt to exploit that connection for personal gain?" Zoe shook her head. "No. When Mr. Montgomery offered me a position with a substantial salary, I declined specifically because I didn't want to be seen as taking advantage of him or causing family conflict." Elaine nodded. "Yet Richard Montgomery has characterized you as an opportunist targeting his vulnerable father. How do you respond to that accusation?" Zoe paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think it reveals more about Mr. Richard's worldview than about my character. He seems unable to recognize genuine compassion without assuming ulterior motives." This simple observation caused a ripple of reaction through the courtroom. Elaine continued, "During your interactions with Harold Montgomery, did you observe him to be mentally incapacitated or unable to make rational decisions?" "No," Zoe answered firmly. "Mr. A. Montgomery occasionally seemed confused about his location or recent events, but he spoke coherently about complex technical concepts from his career and demonstrated clear reasoning about current situations. His memory issues seemed specific, not general, and didn't affect his ability to express his values or make value-aligned choices. Richard's attorney stood for cross-examination, his expression smugly confident. "Miss Washington, isn't it true that you and your mother were facing eviction at the time you, coincidentally, encountered one of the wealthiest men in the city?" His tone made the question an accusation. Zoe met his gaze steadily. "Yes, we were facing eviction. But I had no idea who Mr. Montgomery was when I found him in the snow. I would have helped anyone in that situation." The attorney's smile was condescending. "How convenient that your random act of kindness happened to benefit you so substantially." Zoe didn't take the bait. "I didn't benefit from helping Mr. Montgomery. In fact, I lost my coat, and scarf missed work, became ill. Myself faced ridicule at school, had my scholarship threatened, was removed from a crucial music recital that could have helped me get into college, and became the subject of false newspaper stories questioning my character. If I had known these would be the consequences, I might still have helped Mr. Montgomery, but I wouldn't call that beneficial to me." Her calm recitation of consequences silenced the attorney momentarily. He switched tactics. "You've been staying at Victoria Chen's property, have you not? Receiving medical care from Harold Montgomery's personal physician. These seem like significant benefits." Zoe nodded. "Those came much later, after Mr. Richard had already orchestrated our eviction through his connections with our landlord and spread false rumors about my mother having a criminal record. Miss Chen offered us shelter after we had nowhere else to go, due to actions taken by Mr. Problig.org. Richard, not by Mr. Harold." The attorney's frustration became visible as his attempts to trip Zoe up repeatedly failed. As a final effort, he produced a folder with a flourish. "I have here documented evidence of your history of manipulative behavior at Westfield Academy, provided by school administrators." Elaine immediately objected. "Your Honor, defense has not been provided with these alleged documents during discovery." Judge Burroughs reluctantly sustained the objection, but the damage to the jury's perception had been attempted. After Zoe stepped down, Harold took the stand, appearing simultaneously fragile and formidable. He spoke clearly about his occasional confusion regarding locations and recent events, but demonstrated sharp recall of financial details, company history, and his long-term philanthropic goals. When questioned about his offer to Zoe, he responded with dignity. "I recognized in this young woman the character and integrity that I've sought to foster throughout my company and foundation. Her compassion crossed boundaries that our society still maintains to our shame. My offer was not a moment of confusion, but a recognition of rare human quality." As the afternoon progressed, medical experts testified about Harold's condition, describing it as mild cognitive impairment rather than dementia, treatable with proper medication, and not severe enough to justify removing his decision-making authority. A pharmacologist presented evidence that the medication regimen Richard had been pushing would have artificially exacerbated confusion symptoms, raising serious questions about his motives. Just as Judge Burroughs appeared ready to call for final arguments, clearly eager to conclude proceedings that were increasingly damaging to Richard, the courtroom doors opened dramatically. A group of FBI agents entered, led by a serious-looking woman in a dark suit. "Your Honor," she announced, "I'm Special Agent Rebecca Torres. We have federal warrants for the arrest of Richard Montgomery on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and violations of the RICO Act." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Richard leapt to his feet, shouting about a setup, while his attorneys clustered around him in panic. Judge Burroughs pounded his gavel ineffectively, his face ashen. "What is the meaning of this interruption of my court?" Special Agent Torres approached the bench presenting documents. "These warrants are based on evidence provided to our office regarding systematic embezzlement from the Montgomery Foundation, bribing of public officials, and conspiracy to violate fair housing laws through discriminatory development practices." She turned toward Richard. "We also have evidence of your involvement in manipulating city resources to deliberately underserve minority neighborhoods as part of a price-fixing scheme for future property acquisition." As the agents moved to take Richard into custody, he locked eyes with Zoe, his face contorted with hatred. "You," he spat, "you did this." Then his gaze shifted to his father. "This was your plan all along. You set me up." Harold watched his son with sadness rather than triumph. "No, Richard. You set yourself up through years of choices that betrayed everything this company was built to stand for. I merely created the opportunity for those choices to come to light." As Richard was led away, Agent Torres approached Zoe and Victoria. "The documentation you provided was instrumental in building this case. We've been investigating Richard Montgomery for months, but your evidence connected key components we couldn't previously link." Judge Burroughs, visibly shaken by these developments and suddenly aware of how his connection to Richard might appear, announced he would recuse himself from the competency case. "Given these extraordinary circumstances, I'm transferring this matter to Judge Watkins for fresh consideration." With Richard's dramatic removal and the competency hearing postponed, the courtroom slowly emptied. Harold, exhausted but vindicated, was surrounded by supportive board members who had witnessed his clear competence throughout the proceedings. Outside on the courthouse, steps reporters clamored for statements. Harold, standing with surprising strength, addressed the cameras with Zoe, Victoria, and Diana beside him. "Today marks a new chapter for Montgomery Technologies and the Montgomery Foundation. I'm announcing the appointment of Victoria Chen as interim CEO of the corporation until new leadership structures are implemented." He placed his hand gently on Zoe's shoulder. "And I'm proud to announce Zoe Washington as the head of the newly established Montgomery Foundation for Community Empowerment, which will focus on addressing systemic inequalities in housing, education, and healthcare." Zoe looked up in shock. She hadn't been told about this appointment beforehand. Harold smiled at her reaction. "Miss Washington will work with a team of experienced advisors while completing her education, bringing her first-hand understanding of these issues to guide our foundation's mission. Her compassion saved more than just an old man in a snowstorm. It saved the soul of everything I've built." 1 year later, Zoe stood at a podium in the newly constructed Montgomery Community Center, located in the heart of a revitalized Riverside neighborhood. The modern building, with its glass facade and welcoming design, stood as a physical representation of the transformation that had occurred in the community over the past 12 months. Behind her sat rows of community members, Montgomery Technologies, employees, and media representatives, all gathered for the first anniversary celebration of the Montgomery Foundation for Community Empowerment. In the front row, Diana Washington, fully recovered and radiating health, sat beside Harold Montgomery, who, despite his physical frailty, watched Zoe with unmistakable pride. Victoria Chen, now the permanent CEO of Montgomery Technologies after her interim leadership, had driven the company to record profitability through ethical practices, sat nearby with her nephew James, who had become one of Zoe's closest friends and allies at Westfield Academy. 1 year ago today, Zoe began her voice strong and confident in a way that would have been unimaginable to her former self. This community stood at a crossroads. Riverside had been systematically neglected for decades, with essential services cut, infrastructure crumbling, and residents being pushed out through deliberate disinvestment. She gestured to the large windows behind her through which the audience could see newly paved streets, renovated housing, and a bustling commercial district. Today, we stand in a neighborhood transformed not by displacement and gentrification, but by investment in the people who have always been the heart of this community. The Montgomery Foundation, under Zoe's guidance, and with Harold's unwavering support, had established programs addressing systemic racism in housing, education, and healthcare throughout the city. The community center housed a state-of-the-art medical clinic, offering free and low-cost care, educational support services, including college preparation and scholarship assistance, legal aid for housing discrimination, cases, and small business development resources. Diana now ran the center's healthcare advocacy program, using her experience navigating broken systems to help others access the care they deserved. Her natural empathy and fierce determination made her a powerful advocate for patients facing discrimination. "Our work has just begun." Zoe continued, but the results already speak for themselves. 87% of Riverside residents who were facing displacement have been able to remain in their homes. Our educational support programs have helped 123 students secure college scholarships. The community clinic has provided care to over 4,000 patients who previously had no access to quality health care. As Zoe detailed the Foundation's accomplishments, the screen behind her displayed photos and testimonials from community members whose lives had been changed. Among the faces were several of Zoe's former classmates from Westfield Academy, who had initially shunned her during the Montgomery controversy, but now volunteered regularly at the center. Even Mrs. Holloway had undergone a remarkable transformation after Zoe was accepted to Juilliard on a full scholarship for piano performance. The music teacher had been forced to confront her biased assessments and now served as a consultant for the Foundation's Performing Arts program, working to ensure talented students from all backgrounds received equal opportunities and recognition. From the audience, Zoe could see Mr. Davis beaming with pride. He had left Westfield Academy to become the education director at the Montgomery Foundation, implementing programs that addressed the systemic barriers he had once been part of maintaining. His comprehensive records documenting discrimination at Westfield had led to a complete overhaul of the school's scholarship and disciplinary systems. Today, I'm excited to announce that the Montgomery Foundation will be expanding our initiative nationwide, Zoe revealed to enthusiastic applause. Over the next 5 years, we will establish community empowerment centers in 20 underserved neighborhoods across the country, replicating the successful model we've built here in Riverside. The announcement represented an investment of over $200 million, making it one of the largest private commitments to addressing systemic inequality in the nation's history. Unknown to most of the audience, Richard Montgomery was watching this broadcast from a federal prison, where he was serving a 15-year sentence for his financial crimes and civil rights violations. The evidence Zoe and Victoria had compiled had led investigators to discover far more extensive corruption than even they had suspected, including offshore accounts holding embezzled foundation funds and documentation of bribes paid to city officials to suppress services in minority neighborhoods. The Montgomery Technologies Board of Directors, once dominated by Richard's allies, had been restructured with Victoria as CEO. Under her leadership, the company had embraced Harold's original vision of ethical innovation, proving that corporate responsibility and profitability could coexist. The new board reflected the diversity of the communities they served, bringing perspectives that had previously been excluded from corporate decision-making. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and toured the facility, Zoe found Harold sitting alone in the center's garden, a peaceful space designed for reflection and healing. She sat beside him on a bench dedicated to Elizabeth's memory. "What did you think?" she asked. Harold's smile was gentle. "I think you've accomplished more in 1 year than most people do in a lifetime. You've taken my vision and expanded it beyond anything I could have imagined." He reached for her hand, his own thin and spotted with age, but still warm. "There's something I need to tell you. I've made some changes to my will." Zoe began to protest, but he continued, "I'm not just leaving you a portion of my wealth, though that is part of it. I'm naming you as my legal heir, not just to my fortune, but to my vision." He looked at her with complete certainty. "You didn't just save an old man that night in the snow. You saved my legacy, and gave me something I lost long ago, hope for the future." Later that evening, Zoe performed at a benefit concert in the center's auditorium. Her fingers moved across the piano keys with both technical precision and emotional depth as she played a piece she had composed herself titled Bridges. The music told the story of their journey, a chance encounter in a snowstorm that had transformed not just their lives, but an entire community. As the final notes faded, Harold was the first to rise for a standing ovation, followed quickly by the entire audience. Looking out at the diverse faces united in appreciation of beauty and possibility, Zoe understood what Harold had meant about legacy. It wasn't about buildings or money or even programs important as those were. It was about creating connections across divides that seemed unbridgeable, proving that compassion could indeed change destinies forever. Have you ever experienced or witnessed an act of kindness that transformed someone's life? We'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story of courage against discrimination moved you, Please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that reveal the reality of prejudice and the possibility of change in America. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that small acts of compassion can have enormous impact. Thank you for watching, and remember that each of us has the power to be the person who stops and helps when others walk by. This story reveals powerful truths about our society and human nature. First, it demonstrates how systemic racism operates not just through overt discrimination, but through institutional policies, resource allocation, and societal assumptions. Zoe faced barriers at every turn. From police profiling to business owners locking doors, from scholarship committees to music teachers dismissing her talent. Second, it illustrates how wealth and privilege create different standards of humanity. Harold received immediate attention once his identity was known, while Zoe was treated with suspicion despite being his savior. This differential treatment reveals how deeply ingrained racial and economic biases affect daily interactions. Third, the story shows that authentic compassion transcends societal divisions. Zoe's simple act of kindness, helping when others walked by, created ripples that transformed an entire community. Her action wasn't calculated for reward, but came from genuine humanity. Perhaps most importantly, this narrative demonstrates that systemic change requires both courage and position. Harold had resources but needed Zoe's perspective. Zoe had insight but needed Harold's platform. Together, they created more meaningful change than either could accomplish alone. Finally, the story reminds us that our choices define us, not our circumstances. Richard chose greed and prejudice despite privilege. Zoe chose compassion despite hardship. True character reveals itself not when life is easy, but when we face our defining moments. Has someone ever judged you based on appearances rather than character? Or have you witnessed someone being discriminated against simply because of who they are? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might help others feel less alone in their struggles. If this narrative of overcoming prejudice resonated with you, please hit that like button to help others discover it too. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that challenge how we see the world and each other. And if you know someone who's fighting against discrimination or needs a reminder that their compassion matters, share this video with them today. Remember, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the most profound changes in our world. Thank you for watching, and may we all have the courage to be like Zoe when faced with injustice, to stand firm, speak truth, and extend compassion even when it's difficult.